The spotlight hit her face with the force of 1,000 suns, and in that exact moment, with 12,000 people watching, Tina Turner's knees buckled and the world went dark. It happened so fast that the guitarist didn't even notice at first, his fingers still working the strings, while the Queen of Rock collapsed onto the stage floor like a puppet whose strings had been cut all at once. Before we dive into what happened next and how Tina shocked everyone with her incredible response, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another incredible story like this one. The year was 1975, and Tina Turner was living what most people would call a nightmare disguised as success. She had been performing nearly every single night for months, traveling from city to city in cramped tour buses that smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee, sleeping maybe 3 or 4 hours between shows if she was lucky. Her marriage to Ike Turner had become a prison of constant control and abuse, but the public saw none of that. They only saw the electrifying performer who could command a stage with a voice that could shake the rafters and legs that never seemed to stop moving. What they didn't see were the bruises carefully covered with makeup, the exhaustion that had settled into her bones like concrete, or the way she sometimes stood backstage before a show and wondered if her body could carry her through one more night. She was 36 years old but felt ancient, worn down by years of relentless touring, physical abuse, and the crushing weight of being both the star and the victim in a relationship that was slowly destroying her from the inside out. The venue that night was somewhere in the Midwest, one of those mid-sized theaters that held anywhere from 10 to 15,000 people, with red velvet seats and ornate golden trim on the balconies that had seen better days. The air conditioning barely worked, and by the time Tina took the stage, the heat inside had become almost unbearable, a thick humidity that clung to everyone's skin and made the air taste like metal. She had performed the opening numbers flawlessly as always, her voice cutting through the music with that signature rasp that made every word sound like both a plea and a command. She wore a short sequin dress that caught the stage lights and threw tiny rainbows across the first few rows, her legs in fishnet stockings that were already damp with sweat, her heels higher than most women would dare attempt for a casual walk, much less a 2-hour performance that demanded constant movement. The band behind her was tight and professional, men who had played these songs so many times they could do it in their sleep, and they followed her every move with practiced precision. Tina had been pushing through a headache since the afternoon, the kind that started behind the eyes and slowly spread until it felt like someone was tightening a vice around her skull. She had mentioned it to no one because mentioning weakness around Ike was never a good idea, and besides, she had performed through worse. There had been nights when she sang with cracked ribs, nights when she could barely open one eye because of the swelling from a backstage argument that had turned violent, nights when she wondered if she would even make it to the stage, but she always did. She always found a way to step into those lights and become someone else, someone powerful and untouchable, even if it was just for 90 minutes. Except tonight, her body had decided it had reached its absolute limit, and no amount of willpower was going to change that fact. She was midway through Proud Mary, the song that always brought the house down, the one where she started slow and built it up until the entire audience was on their feet. She had just hit the part where the tempo shifts and the energy explodes, where she normally would spin and drop and make it look effortless, when suddenly her vision started to tunnel. The edges went dark first, like someone was slowly closing curtains from both sides, and the sound became muffled and distant, even though the music was still blasting through the speakers at full volume. She tried to take a step, and her leg didn't respond the way it should have, her heel catching on nothing and sending her stumbling sideways. The backup singers noticed immediately, their harmonies faltering as they watched their lead performer weaving like someone who had forgotten how to walk. And that's when Tina Turner went down. She didn't fall gracefully. There was no dramatic swoon or gentle collapse. She simply dropped, her body crumpling onto the stage floor with a thud that was audible even over the music. The microphone fell from her hand and rolled away, creating a screech of feedback that cut through the venue like a knife. For a moment, maybe 3 or 4 seconds that felt like an eternity, nobody moved. The band kept playing because that's what professionals do, their muscle memory carrying them forward even as their eyes were locked on the motionless figure center stage. The audience didn't scream or panic right away. There was just confusion, a collective intake of breath, people leaning forward in their seats trying to understand if this was part of the show or something terrible they weren't supposed to be witnessing. The drummer was the first to stop, his sticks frozen in midair, and then the bass followed, and within seconds the entire theater had gone silent, except for the hum of the amplifiers and the nervous murmur of thousands of people who suddenly didn't know what to do. Tina lay completely still, her sequin dress reflecting the stage lights in a way that made her look almost ethereal,
like a fallen star that had burned too bright and finally flickered out. Her chest was rising and falling, shallow breaths that at least told everyone she was alive, but her eyes were closed, and her face had gone pale beneath the stage makeup that was now streaked with sweat. Backstage, chaos erupted immediately. Roadies and crew members came running from the wings, their heavy boots thundering across the wooden stage, while Ike Turner emerged from somewhere in the back, with a look on his face that was equal parts anger and concern, though anyone who knew him well understood that the anger probably had more to do with the interrupted show than worry for his wife's well-being. Someone brought water, another person grabbed a folding chair, and several hands reached down to lift Tina into a sitting position, even though she was still unconscious. They carried her off stage left, away from the audience's view, into the cramped space behind the heavy curtains where instrument cases and coiled cables lined the walls and the smell of dust mixed with decades of performances past. When Tina came to, maybe 2 or 3 minutes later, though it felt like no time had passed at all, she found herself sitting in that folding chair, with faces hovering around her like concerned moons. Someone was pressing a cold bottle of water against her forehead. Someone else was fanning her with a piece of cardboard, and voices were talking over each other, asking if she was okay, if they should call an ambulance, if the show was over. She blinked several times, trying to get her bearings, trying to remember where she was and what had happened. Her head still throbbed with that vice-like pressure, and every muscle in her body felt like it had been replaced with lead, heavy and unresponsive. She could hear the murmur of the crowd beyond the curtain, thousands of people waiting to see what would happen next, and she could feel Ike's presence nearby even before she saw him, that particular energy he carried that always made her spine stiffen reflexively. The venue manager was there too, a middle-aged man in a cheap suit with sweat stains under his arms, and he was saying something about refunds and liability and how they needed to...
She made a decision quickly. Someone from the medical team, probably just the theater's first aid person, who usually dealt with sprained ankles and heat exhaustion, was checking her pulse and asking her to follow a finger with her eyes. Tina did all of this mechanically, going through the motions while her mind was somewhere else entirely, calculating and processing in the way she had learned to do over years of surviving impossible situations. She knew what would happen if the show ended here. She knew the anger that would come later, the accusations of weakness and unprofessionalism, the way Ike would use this as ammunition for weeks. But more than that, deeper than the fear of consequences, there was something else driving her thoughts. She had spent so many years of her life being told what she couldn't do, being pushed down and controlled and made to feel small despite the massive talent that everyone knew she possessed. She had been beaten down physically and emotionally until most people would have given up entirely, would have walked away or broken completely. But Tina Turner had never been most people. There was something in her core, some unbreakable piece of her spirit that refused to stay down no matter how many times life knocked her to the ground. And sitting there, in that folding chair, with water dripping down her face and her body screaming for rest, she made a decision that would define not just that night, but everything that came after. She stood up. The movement was shaky at first, her legs uncertain beneath her, but she planted her feet and straightened her spine and looked at all the concerned faces around her with eyes that had suddenly regained their fire. The medical person protested immediately, saying she needed to rest, that she had fainted and should really go to a hospital for observation. The venue manager looked relieved because a canceled show meant complicated insurance claims and angry patrons. Ike said nothing, just watched her with that unreadable expression he wore so well, but Tina didn't need his permission or his approval. She reached up and adjusted her wig, which had gone slightly askew during the fall, and smoothed down the front of her dress. She asked someone to bring her the microphone, and when they hesitated, she asked again with more force, her voice carrying that authority that came from years of commanding stages and refusing to be silenced. They tried to convince her otherwise. The crew members who genuinely cared about her well-being told her it was okay to stop, that no one would think less of her, that her health was more important than any show. But Tina knew something they didn't. She knew that if she walked away now, if she let her body's weakness win, it would be one more thing taken from her, one more piece of control surrendered in a life where she had so little left. This wasn't about the audience anymore, or about the money, or about fulfilling a contract. This was about proving to herself that she still had power, that even when everything else was falling apart, she could choose to stand back up. She took several deep breaths, drank some of the water they had brought, and walked back toward the stage entrance. The audience erupted when she emerged from the wings. They had been sitting in confused silence for nearly 10 minutes, unsure whether to leave or stay, when suddenly there she was, walking back to center stage with the microphone in her hand and that unmistakable presence that made her larger than life despite her relatively small frame.
The applause started scattered and then built like a wave, people rising to their feet not because she had performed something spectacular, but because she was simply there, refusing to give up. Tina stood at the microphone for a moment, letting the noise wash over her, and then she raised one hand to quiet them down. She didn't apologize or explain what had happened. She didn't make excuses or show vulnerability. She simply said,
"Thank you," told them she was ready to continue, and counted off the band to start the next song. What followed was nothing short of extraordinary. Tina Turner didn't just finish the show, didn't just limp through the remaining songs with diminished energy. She performed with an intensity that somehow exceeded what she had been giving before the collapse. Every note carried weight, every movement had purpose, and she poured everything she had left into those final 45 minutes, like a boxer who knows they're behind on points and decides to leave everything in the ring. She danced harder, sang louder, connected with the audience in a way that transcended the usual performer-spectator relationship. People in the crowd that night would later say they had never seen anything like it, that they witnessed something profound, even if they couldn't quite put it into words at the time. The band matched her energy, feeding off her determination and playing with renewed vigor. The backup singers harmonized with extra soul, their voices wrapping around Tina's like a safety net made of music. And Tina herself seemed to draw strength from somewhere beyond her physical body, tapping into reserves she didn't know she had. When she hit the high notes, they soared. When she dropped into the growls and rasps, they rumbled through the theater like thunder. And when she finally closed out the show with a final number that brought everyone back to their feet, there wasn't a person in that venue who wasn't emotionally exhausted just from watching her. Backstage after the show, Tina collapsed again, but this time it was different. This time it was the natural exhaustion of someone who had given absolutely everything, who had pushed past every reasonable limit and emerged on the other side. The crew caught her before she hit the floor and helped her to a proper couch in the dressing room, where she lay for a long time just breathing, her body finally getting the rest it had been desperately trying to demand all day. Nobody bothered her with questions or concerns. They simply let her be, understanding without words that they had witnessed something special, something that went beyond entertainment into the realm of human triumph. That night became a story that circulated among musicians and crew members for years, told and retold in green rooms and tour buses, sometimes embellished but mostly just remembered with awe. It wasn't captured on film, wasn't written about in major newspapers, didn't become a famous moment in rock history with its own Wikipedia entry. But for everyone who was there, it remained a defining memory, proof that Tina Turner was made of something different than most people. Word spread through the industry about the night she fainted on stage and then came back to deliver the performance of her life, and it added another layer to her growing reputation as someone who simply could not be broken. For Tina herself, that night marked a turning point in her understanding of her own strength. She had always known she could endure, had survived years of abuse and exploitation by simply putting one foot in front of the other and getting through each day. But this was different. This was active choice in the face of genuine physical failure, a decision to reclaim power in a moment when every logical part of her brain was screaming to stop. It planted a seed that would grow over the coming years, a recognition that she didn't have to accept the life that had been built around her, that she had the strength not just to survive, but to escape and rebuild entirely. The following morning, she woke up in a hotel room with every muscle aching and her head still carrying echoes of that crushing pressure, but also with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone who had proven something important, not to the audience or to the industry, but to the woman staring back at her. That woman was capable of more than just endurance. That woman was capable of transformation, of taking control, of becoming the architect of her own destiny, rather than the victim of someone else's design. It would still be several more years before Tina finally left Ike, before she would walk away with nothing but 36 cents and a gas station credit card and start the long climb to becoming the international superstar she was always meant to be. But the night she fainted and got back up was when she first truly understood that escape was possible, that she possessed within herself everything she needed to survive on her own terms. The venue in the Midwest went on to host countless other shows, other performers who came and went and were mostly forgotten by everyone except the most dedicated fans. But people who worked there for years afterward would occasionally mention the night Tina Turner collapsed on their stage and then delivered the most powerful performance they had ever witnessed. And younger staff members would listen with skepticism until they saw footage of Tina in her later years and understood that yes, this woman was absolutely capable of exactly that kind of indomitable spirit. The stage where it happened was eventually renovated, then torn down entirely when the theater was modernized in the late 1980s. But the memory lived on in stories, and in the legend that continued to grow around a woman who refused to let anything keep her down. Tina Turner would go on to become one of the biggest selling artists of all time, would fill stadiums around the world, would earn Grammy Awards and accolades and recognition as the queen of rock and roll. She would survive and thrive and build a second act to her career that exceeded anything from her first. But none of it would have been possible without the accumulated strength built in moments like that night in the mid-70s, without the countless times she had to choose between giving up and pushing forward, without the deep understanding that her spirit was stronger than her circumstances. The night she fainted mid-performance and shocked everyone by getting back up wasn't about entertaining an audience or fulfilling a contract. It was about a woman discovering the depths of her own power, about refusing to let exhaustion or abuse or circumstance define her limits, and about proving that sometimes the most important performances are the ones we give for ourselves when no one else is watching closely enough to understand what they really mean.